The wind howled through the dense Ardennes forest, carrying with it the scent of war, gunpowder, sweat, and the unmistakable stench of death. Sergeant James, Jim, Callahan crouched behind a splintered tree, his rifle held tightly in his frostbitten hands. Snowflakes swirled in the night air, blanketing the bodies of fallen soldiers, friend and foe alike. His unit had been holding this position for days, waiting for reinforcements that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. "Sergeant," whispered Private Andrews, his voice barely audible over the wind. "They're regrouping." Jim peered through his binoculars and spotted movement in the distance. German troops, their silhouettes barely visible against the white snow, were preparing for another assault. He clenched his jaw. Their numbers were thinning. Ammunition was running low. If the enemy broke through, they'd be overrun. "Stay low," Jim ordered. "Hold your fire until they get close." His men, what remained of them, huddled behind makeshift barricades of sandbags and fallen logs. Each face was etched with exhaustion, their eyes hollow from days without proper rest. Yet they stood their ground. They had to. The first shots rang out, cracking through the frozen night like thunder. Muzzle flashes illuminated the battlefield in brief, blinding bursts. Jim fired his rifle, dropping an advancing German soldier. Beside him, Corporal Lewis let loose a burst from his Thompson submachine gun, cutting down 2 more. Explosions erupted as enemy mortars rained down. Trees shattered, sending wooden shrapnel flying. Jim ducked as a blast sent a cloud of snow and dirt into the air. He heard a scream. One of his men was hit. He turned to see Private Dawson clutching his bleeding leg, his face twisted in agony. "We need a medic," Jim shouted, but the words were futile. Their medic had been killed 2 days ago. Gritting his teeth, Jim pulled Dawson to cover. The young soldier whimpered, barely able to move. "You'll be okay, kid," Jim muttered, though he wasn't sure he believed to himself. The Germans pressed forward, their assault relentless. Jim's men fought tooth and nail, firing until their weapons clicked empty. When their bullets ran dry, they resorted to bayonets and fists. The battle devolved into chaotic, close-quarters combat, each soldier locked in a desperate struggle for survival. Hours felt like days. The world became a blur of smoke, fire, and blood. Jim's arms ached from swinging his rifle like a club. He dodged a bayonet thrust and countered with a fierce strike to an enemy's jaw. The German crumpled to the ground, unconscious or dead. Jim didn't care. The battle intensifies. By dawn, the battle showed no sign of stopping. The Germans had been momentarily repelled, but Jim knew they would return with greater force. His men were running on fumes, barely holding on as fatigue set in. Corporal Lewis crawled beside Jim, panting. "Sir, our ammo is almost gone. We won't last another wave." Jim wiped the sweat and grime from his face, formulating a desperate plan. "We dig in. Use whatever you can, bayonets, knives, rocks if you have to. No one runs." A distant, eerie silence fell over the battlefield. It was too quiet. Then a single flare shot into the sky, and Jim knew the next wave was coming. Gunfire erupted once more. The Germans charged with renewed aggression, their numbers overwhelming. Jim and his men fired what little ammunition they had left before engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was ruthless, soldiers stabbing, punching, wrestling in the snow, the air filled with the sounds of agony and desperation. Jim took a blow to the ribs, falling to the ground. A German soldier raised his bayonet, ready to strike, but before he could, Private Andrews tackled him, saving Jim's life. Jim scrambled to his feet, driving his knife into another attacker. Every second was a fight to survive. The final stand. By late afternoon, only a handful of Jim's men remained. The enemy was relentless, pressing forward with no end in sight. Jim knew they couldn't hold out much longer. A distant rumbling filled the air. Tanks. Jim's stomach twisted. They had nothing left to stop armored units. No anti-tank weapons. No reinforcements. No chance. "Sergeant," Lewis croaked. "This might be it." Jim tightened his grip on his rifle. He had known this war would take everything from him. He had watched friends die, had seen the horrors of battle firsthand. And now it seemed it was his turn. Then, through the trees, a new sound emerged, the unmistakable roar of American artillery. Jim's heart leaped as shells rained down upon the enemy, sending German soldiers scrambling for cover. The ground trembled as tanks rolled in, not German, but American. Reinforcements had arrived. Cheers erupted from his battered unit as fresh troops poured into the battlefield, pushing the enemy back. Jim fell to his knees, overwhelmed with relief. He had been prepared to die, but somehow, against all odds, they had held on long enough. Aftermath. When the battle ended, Jim surveyed the aftermath. The ground was a frozen graveyard, littered with bodies and spent ammunition. The price of holding the line had been steep. As medics rushed to tend to the wounded, Jim closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaustion washing over him. They had survived, but at a great cost. The battle for the Western Front was far from over, but at least, for now, they had won. Jim stood, looking at his remaining men. They were battered, bruised, but alive. And in war, that was victory enough. He took a deep breath, gripping his rifle tighter. Tomorrow, the fight would continue.